So far for sentence structure, we've been focusing on independent clauses. But what happens when you have a sentence, quote unquote, that doesn't have an independent clause? And that's when you get a fragment. So a fragment is a sentence, put in quotes, it's not really a sentence, that can't stand by itself. So either you have a phrase or some kind of dependent clause. It's not an independent clause. So basically, doesn't have an independent clause or isn't an independent clause. And it has often no main verb. Not always, because you can have dependent clauses that are still fragments, but often doesn't have any main verb. Let's look at some examples. Thinking over all his options. So we have a verbal, we have something that looks like a verb, but in this case, this is like a gerund or something, probably a gerund in this case. Or a participle. So this is not a main verb. There's actually no subject to this either. So this is a fragment. And sometimes you might see your teachers write frag, and that's what they mean. It's not a complete sentence. It can't stand on its own. It needs something else. Thinking over all his options, John decided to enroll, right? That would be an example of how you can make that sentence complete. The mansion located on the outskirts of town. Okay, again, this is a noun phrase. I think we've seen this earlier. It contains a verbal, but this is actually a past participle because this whole phrase here is describing the mansion. If you think about it, located can't be in itself a main verb. If it said the mansion is located on the outskirts of town, well, then you'd be okay because is works. But you can't say the mansion located on the outskirts of town. This is describing this. This is just one large noun phrase. To improve your SAT skills. Okay, this is an infinitive, but it's not a main verb, right? This is a verbal, looks verb-like, but there's no subject, there's no main verb, no finite verb, another fragment. Roger baking the fresh bread. Again, we've got something that looks like a verb, but this is just a participle. We need, for instance, one way to fix this would be to add is. Roger is baking the fresh bread. Fine. As written, though, it's a fragment. In Japan during the war. Here we've just got a series of prepositional phrases, right? Prepositional phrases are phrases. They cannot just stand by themselves. Let's get to some more complex ones. The violinist who trained with the great masters playing at the theater right now. So we've got our subject, the violinist. Who trained with the great masters? This is a relative clause modifying the violinist. And then notice right after that we have a verbal, not a verb. Not a main verb. It looks like a verb, but it's not a main verb. If it said, again, like is playing or was playing, it would be fine. Or if you change this to plays or will be playing or whatever it might be, right? That would be fine. But this is not a main verb, so even though it looks long, it's still a fragment. And this is one of the things you'll see on the SAT, especially when they put these clauses in the middle or these phrases in the middle to throw you off of the relationship between your subject and your verb. But as you know from subject-verb agreement, you always got to make sure your subject and your verb agree, or even, like in this case, you have a verb in the first place. Steve Jobs, a visionary inventor and businessman, and placed many demands on his employees. So wait a minute, we got Steve Jobs as our subject. We have what's called an appositive phrase, which I haven't introduced yet, but basically it just describes or renames the noun right before it. So this is fine. It's just talking about who Steve Jobs is. But then notice right after the comma we have an end. Well, wait a minute. Where's the verb that goes with Steve Jobs? If the sentence says, Steve Jobs, a visionary inventor and businessman, was very strict and placed many demands on his employees, that would work, right? Because then we'd have a main verb to go with Steve Jobs, and then we can complete the compound predicate here, right? And placed many demands. But as written, we're missing a main verb. So even though, again, it's long and it does have a verb right here, it's still a fragment because this does not have any relationship to any verb in the sentence. Even though he followed the rules and regulations to the letter. So here we have a subordinating conjunction or a subordinate clause. And yeah, it has a subject and a verb relationship, but it's a dependent clause. We need, in theory, to complete the sentence with something else. So even though he followed the rules and regulations to the letter, Bob still got in trouble, period, right? So that Bob still got in trouble is the independent clause on which this subordinate clause depends. So this is still a fragment, even though it's got a subject and a verb, because it's a subordinating conjunction that starts it. Last one, riding his bike through the wind and rain, the racer who trained for months to win this race. So lots of verbs, lots of verbals on here, but is this a full sentence? Well, notice we start with this participial phrase, riding his bike through the wind and rain, describing the racer. And then we have the subject. And then we have a relative clause modifying the racer, but we have no main verb. So, at the end, if we added who trained for months to win this race, slipped on the road or something, whatever it might be, right? So we've got a main verb, completes the sentence, then we'd have an independent clause, and then we'd have a non-fragment. But as written, this is a fragment. So in general, always look, as I said, for the subject-finite-verb relationship. Not only for subject-verb agreement, but even to detect if there's a main verb in the first place. Make sure that if you find a main verb, if you see a clause, that it's an independent clause and not just a dependent clause like we have here, right? Even if you had a main verb and subject, if it's dependent on an independent clause, it's still a fragment. And then look for fragments in the question, obviously, and the answer choices. So sometimes you'll see answer choices that are going to fix the error in the original, but if they introduce a new error like a fragment, it's still wrong. Okay, let's move on.